When I first met him, it felt like someone had finally opened a door to a life I'd been secretly sketching in my head for years. We talked for hours about everything: our kids, our dreams, our scars. He was funny, charming, and thoughtful. The kind of man who sent me good morning texts and asked about my day without it feeling like a checklist. After my own years of uncertainty and heartbreak, I wanted so badly to believe this was the one. When we decided to move in together nearly 2 years later, it felt like a natural next step, not a leap. My house, though rented, became our house. We blended our families, our stepkids slowly orbiting each other like little planets learning new gravity. For 6 months, I tried to build a space that felt like forever for all of us. In those early weeks, I remember making pancakes on Sunday mornings, the smell of syrup and coffee weaving into the sound of kids laughing over cartoons. I remember him wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at the stove, murmuring about how lucky we were. I remember my heart swelling with hope. I wanted to be not just a partner, but an anchor for him, for the kids, for the dream we were weaving together. I hung new curtains, rearranged furniture, made room in the closets. I believed that love and intention could create safety. But almost as soon as the boxes were unpacked, something shifted. It wasn't a thunderclap, not at first, more like a low hum that grew louder. Little comments about how I should dress differently, speak differently, parent differently. Small corrections at first, almost disguised as concern. "You'd be happier if you changed this," or "I just wish you'd do that." I brushed them off, thinking he was stressed, thinking we were still adjusting. We both had histories, after all. He'd been cheated on in his marriage. He carried a restless energy that sometimes looked like ADHD, sometimes like panic. I had my own wounds and triggers. We both needed patience. I told myself love meant patience. So I doubled down. I kept a mental tally of every perceived flaw he pointed out and tried to address them. If he said I was too distant, I'd be warmer. If he said I was too lenient with the kids, I'd tighten up. If he said I didn't listen enough, I'd pause mid-task to give him my full attention. At night I journaled about my progress, wrote down what I could work on. I even started therapy to unearth old hurts and patterns, determined not to sabotage what felt like my one shot at a real, lasting partnership. Meanwhile, the household rhythm grew more brittle. The kids felt it, even if they couldn't name it. They'd look at me with wary eyes during one of his critiques, as if waiting to see how I'd react. Sometimes I'd smile it off. Other times I'd snap, then feel guilty. I hated that tension was replacing laughter, that our blended family, this careful experiment, was starting to fracture under unseen pressure. Yet I kept telling myself it was just growing pains, that every new family struggled in the beginning. 6 months in, the comments became ultimatums. Change or I'll leave. Do this or I'm done. It wasn't about one behavior, but a moving target, my tone, my schedule, my boundaries, my way of being. Each time he threatened to move out with the kids, my stomach clenched as if someone had reached inside and twisted it. The thought of losing them all felt unbearable. I'd picture their empty rooms, their toothbrushes gone from the bathroom, the echo of their laughter fading down the hall. So I tried harder. I told myself he was scared, traumatized, acting out of fear. I told myself I could be his safe place, but something in me was wearing thin. Late at night, after everyone was asleep, I'd sit in the dark kitchen, the only light the glow from the microwave clock. I'd ask myself if love was supposed to feel like this, like walking on eggshells, like constantly auditioning for approval. I'd replay our early days and wonder how we'd gone from lucky to change, or else in half a year. Sometimes I'd cry silently into a dish towel so the kids wouldn't hear. Sometimes I'd pray for clarity. He had his reasons, of course. He told me about his ex-wife, about betrayal, about being left without warning. He told me his ADHD made it hard to regulate emotions, that he needed structure, reassurance, security. I wanted to understand. I wanted to be the one who didn't abandon him, who stayed through the storms. But each time he threatened to leave, a small crack formed in my own foundation. Each time he raised his voice, my own voice dimmed a little more. And yet, I stayed. I rearranged my schedule to soothe his insecurities. I read articles about disorganized attachment, about trauma bonding, about how to support a partner with ADHD. I learned new communication tools. I offered therapy. I apologized for things I hadn't even realized I'd done. I thought if I just did enough work, my work, his work, all the work, we could find our way back to those pancake mornings and soft embraces at the stove. What I didn't see at the time was how much of myself I was sacrificing to keep the peace. My hobbies dwindled. My friendships thinned. My laughter became quieter. My world narrowed to his moods and the kids' needs, and somewhere in that shrinking space I lost sight of my own. Looking back now, I think I was afraid of the truth that love alone might not be enough, that I could pour every ounce of myself into fixing us and still not succeed. That realization was too terrifying to face, so I kept going, hoping the next compromise, the next apology, the next self-improvement would finally be the key. But hope can be heavy when it's carried alone. And as the weeks went on, the weight of that hope began to press against my ribs like a stone. The breaking point didn't arrive as a single explosion, but as a series of tremors that cracked me from the inside out. By the time it came, I had been living in a state of constant anticipation, like bracing for a storm that never fully arrived but also never ended. His words change or I'll leave echoed in my head as though etched into the walls. Each repetition took something from me, a sliver of self-trust, a slice of calm, a strand of the hope I'd wrapped around us. I'd been telling myself that if I just worked harder, if I became the partner he wanted, things would get better. So I kept my tone soft, rearranged my days, attended therapy, wrote out plans to be more present, more patient, more everything. But nothing was ever enough. I would fix one thing and another would appear. I felt like I was running a marathon on shifting sand, trying to reach a finish line that receded every time I neared it. I started to notice the toll it was taking on my body. My sleep grew restless. My appetite disappeared. I'd wake in the middle of the night with my heart racing, as if I'd been startled awake by a sound only I could hear. My hands trembled when he raised his voice. Not out of fear he would hit me, he never did, but out of the deep, bone-level exhaustion of never being able to get it right. Even when he wasn't in the room, I felt his disapproval like static in the air. Still, I kept trying. I told myself he was traumatized. I read more about disorganized attachment, about how people with his kind of history could swing from idealizing to devaluing, from clinging to pushing away. I told myself he wasn't really angry at me, he was angry at ghosts from his past. I thought if I could just be gentle enough, stable enough, understanding enough, he would stop seeing me through the eyes of his ex-wife. But one weekend everything cracked. It wasn't a fight, not exactly. He had threatened to leave again. We were standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd once hugged over pancakes. And he said it again, "If you don't change, if you don't do what I'm asking, I'm taking the kids and moving out." His voice was tight, his eyes darting. Something inside me caved. I spent the whole weekend sobbing, a kind of sobbing that felt older than me, as though all the years of trying to be enough for everyone had finally overflowed. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even look the kids in the face. The thought of them leaving was unbearable, but so was the thought of continuing like this. I walked around the house in a fog, clutching tissues, my chest aching. I thought about my own childhood, about the ways I had learned to disappear when conflict rose. I realized I had been doing it again, shrinking, silencing, bending, thinking it would save me. But this time it wasn't saving me. It was erasing me. That weekend I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to picture our future. If I said yes to everything, if I kept handing over pieces of myself, would it ever be enough for him? Would he ever feel secure? Or would I simply vanish while he kept asking for more? I loved him. That was the cruelest part. I loved him enough to want to fight for us. So, after that weekend of tears, I decided to give him one last chance. But this time, I set a boundary. I told him, "If you ever threaten to leave again, if you ever use that against me, we're done. I can't live like this. You have to promise me you'll stop." He said he understood. He promised. But my trust was fractured. The promise was like a paper bridge over a canyon. So I asked that we slow down our plans. No new place yet. No putting him on the lease. I said we needed to repair first, to build something solid before making another big commitment. I thought this was reasonable, even loving. He did not see it that way. He reacted like I'd yanked the floor out from under him. He said he felt insecure, that he was technically homeless, that he and the kids had no physical security. Every day became a monologue of his pain, his fear, his frustration. He would stand in the living room, eyes wide and desperate, telling me how I'd denied him, how I'd failed him. I tried to soothe him, to explain that I wasn't denying him. I was trying to protect both of us from further harm. But my words fell like feathers against stone, and my voice, my needs, my feelings faded further into the background. Each time I opened my mouth, his pain rushed in like a tide, drowning my sentences. I started to feel like a supporting character in my own life, like my job was simply to absorb, to adjust, to keep him from unraveling. Then came the final ultimatum. We were sitting at the table. The kids were in their rooms. He looked at me with that mix of urgency and anger and said, "You have to decide. Either we move into a new place together, or you put me on the lease, or I'm done. I'm moving out." I felt the air shift. It was as if time slowed and I could see the entire map of our relationship spread out before my all the compromises, all the threats, all the nights I'd cried in silence. I thought about the promise he'd made, the boundary I'd set, and for the first time, instead of scrambling to appease, I stayed still. I said no. I said, "You broke your promise. You knew the consequences. I can't keep living like this. I accept that you're leaving. You have 2 weeks to move out." The words came out calm, almost detached, but inside I was shaking. It felt like stepping off a cliff. I half expected him to call my bluff, to soothe me, to apologize. Instead, he exploded, called me cruel, heartless, accused me of denying him and the kids' security, said 2 weeks wasn't enough time. His words lashed at me, but something inside me stayed firm. A small flame of self-preservation that had finally flickered back to life. I wanted to scream that I hadn't done this lightly, that I'd bent myself into knots trying to make it work, that I knew his trauma, his ADHD, his pain. But all that explaining wouldn't change the truth. The cycle had to end. The night after I told him, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet but heavy, like it was holding its breath. My chest ached with grief. My mind replayed his accusations, my own words, the kids' faces. Was I really cruel, heartless? Was I abandoning them all the way his ex had abandoned him? But underneath the grief was something else, a low hum of clarity. I hadn't refused commitment out of malice. I had refused to lock myself further into a situation that was already unstable. I had asked for repair, for healing, for time. And instead, I'd been given another ultimatum. I realized then that love without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. And I had surrendered enough. Still, the guilt clawed at me. I worried about the kids, about their sense of security, about what stories they would tell themselves about why they had to move again. I worried about him, about whether this would push him further into despair. I worried about being judged by friends and family. But I also knew this. I was finally hearing my own voice again. I didn't know what the next weeks would look like, or how the logistics would unfold, or how the kids would react. But for the first time in months, I felt a strange steadiness in my chest, as though I'd stopped running. And in that steadiness, a thought surfaced, maybe the most loving thing I could do for him, for the kids, for myself, was to stop participating in the cycle that was hurting us all. The morning after my decision felt eerily calm. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin stripes across the floor, and for a moment I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at them. Everything looked the same. My houseplants, the basket of laundry, the kids' drawings stuck to the fridge, but it felt different. It was as if I'd stepped from one version of my life into another overnight. He was quiet that morning too. He didn't shout or plead. He moved around the kitchen stiffly, making coffee without looking at me. I watched him from the hallway and felt a pang of grief, so sharp it almost doubled me over. This was the man I'd loved, the man I'd tried to build a home with. He wasn't a monster. He was hurting. But I had to stop sacrificing myself on the altar of his hurt. Throughout the day, little moments kept flashing through my mind, the way he'd once brushed my hair out of my eyes, the way the kids had giggled during our first movie night together, the first time we'd all eaten dinner at the big table and it had felt like a family. Those memories felt like photographs, already starting to fade at the edges. And then there were the more recent memories, the monologues of his pain, the pointed fingers, the ultimatums. Those felt like bruises on my memory, dark and tender. I carried both sets of memories in my chest at once, love and hurt tangled together, and it was exhausting when the kids came home from school. I made a point of smiling at them, of asking about their day, of listening. It was harder than I expected. Their faces were wary, like they could sense the shift in the air. I realized that they, too, had been living under the tension, adapting to the unpredictability of adults who were supposed to be stable. I wanted to tell them it wasn't their fault, that none of this was their doing. I wanted to tell them they were loved, but I also didn't want to say more than I could promise. Over the next few days, he began packing small things, books, clothes, toiletries. He'd mutter under his breath about how unfair this was, how I could have just put him on the lease and spared everyone the chaos. Sometimes he'd speak directly at me, saying I was denying the kids' security, that I was heartless. Each time it cut, but I tried to remind myself of the truth. I hadn't denied him. I had set a boundary at night after the kids were asleep. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. My hands would shake. My stomach would not. But beneath the fear and guilt, there was still that steadiness, like a small root growing deeper into the soil. I would whisper to myself, "You're not cruel. You're not heartless. You're choosing yourself." It wasn't easy. Each day felt like peeling off a layer of skin. Each conversation was a minefield. Part of me wanted to cave, to say, "Fine, I'll put you on the lease," just to stop the lashing out, just to make the pain go away. But another part of my quieter but stronger knew that caving would only reset the cycle. I started journaling again, writing down everything he said, everything I felt. Seeing it on paper helped me separate his story from mine. His story was that he'd been denied security, abandoned again, left homeless with his kids. My story was that I had tried everything, given everything, and was now trying to protect myself from further harm. Both stories were real, but only one of them was mine to live. Friends reached out when they sensed something was wrong. I hesitated to tell them the truth, afraid they'd judge me, afraid they'd see him as a villain or me as weak. But when I finally confided in one close friend, she said gently, "You've been holding a lot. You're allowed to stop holding it." Her words made me cry with relief. In the final days before he moved out, the house felt like a waiting room. Boxes appeared by the door. The kids grew quiet. Even the air seemed heavy. But inside me, something was shifting. I started cooking meals I liked again. I started humming while I did the dishes. I called my sister just to talk. Small things, but they felt like planting flags in my own life again. On the day he left, it was raining. He loaded the car in silence while the kids sat in the back seat, pale and wide-eyed. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, heart hammering. When he came back inside for the last bag, he paused, looking at me like he wanted to say something. For a second, I thought he might apologize, or ask to stay, or promise to change. But he just said, "I hope you're happy," his voice flat and brittle. Then he turned and left. When the car pulled out of the driveway, my knees went weak. I closed the door, slid down against it, and sobbed. Not the sharp sobs of the weekend before, but a low, shaking release. Like my body was finally letting go of months of tension. I cried for him, for the kids, for myself, for the dream that had died. But beneath the grief was a fragile, flickering sense of freedom. The house was quiet, yes, but it was my quiet. My voice was no longer lost. My boundaries were no longer invisible. I had chosen myself, and that choice had cost me dearly. But it had also saved me. In the days that followed, I kept second-guessing myself. Was I really cruel? Was 2 weeks enough time? Should I have done more? Each time the questions rose, I tried to answer them honestly. No, I wasn't cruel. I had given him chance after chance. 2 weeks was what I could manage while still protecting my own stability. I had done more than most would. I also reminded myself of what I knew about trauma and attachment. His disorganized attachment wasn't my fault. His ADHD wasn't my fault. His pain wasn't mine to fix. Love can be compassionate without being Boundaries can coexist with empathy. Slowly, the guilt started to loosen its grip. I began to imagine a future where my home was peaceful, where my relationships were reciprocal, where my kids and stepkids, if they stayed in touch, could see an adult choosing respect over chaos. One evening, a week after he left, I made pancakes for dinner. The smell of syrup and butter filled the kitchen. It wasn't the same as before, but it was a start. As I flipped the pancakes, I realized my hands weren't trembling anymore. I don't know exactly what comes next. I know there will be co-parenting challenges, awkward conversations, maybe even anger. I know healing isn't linear, but I also know this. I have reclaimed my voice. I have stopped walking on eggshells. I have chosen a different path, and in that choice, I've planted the first seeds of a life where love isn't conditional on my ability to disappear, but grows in the open alongside respect and mutual care.